On a busy city street, Silent Boy's world begins to change with the first notes of a street violinist song and a billionaire. Father's heart is never the same again. The air that afternoon was crisp and cool, the kind of weather that made people pull their coats tighter and walk a little faster. The streets of the city were alive with noise, the steady hum of traffic, the rumble of buses, the chatter of strangers passing one another. Somewhere above it all, faint but clear, came the sound of a violin. It wasn't loud enough to overpower the chaos, but it had a way of slipping through all the other sounds, almost like a soft voice calling out in a crowd. That voice belonged to Elena's violin. Elena stood at her usual place just outside the subway entrance. She had been playing there for months, ever since her life had changed in ways she never imagined. Once, she had dreamed of concert halls and bright stages, of polished floors and chandeliers reflecting golden light. But life didn't ask her dreams for permission before taking a different turn. Her stage was the corner of a busy street. Her audience was made up of strangers rushing past, some tossing coins into her open violin case without slowing down, others glancing for a second before disappearing into the subway below. She had learned not to mind the indifference. Every passerby would stop and listen, and that was fine. For Elena, the music wasn't just for them, it was for her. It was the one thing that made her feel steady when everything else seemed uncertain. Every note she played was a reminder that she still had something beautiful to give. Even if the world didn't always notice, the afternoon had been like any other, at least until she saw him. He was a small boy, maybe 7 years old, standing just a few steps away from the edge of her little performance space. His hair was the kind of golden brown that caught the sunlight, and his coat looked expensive, the sort of thing parents bought when they didn't need to check price tags. But what struck Elena most wasn't his clothes, it was his stillness. Children rarely stood still on the street. They fidgeted, pulled at their parents' hands, pointed at things, asked questions. But this boy was rooted to the spot, as if something in the air had pinned him there. His eyes, a deep, clear shade of blue, were locked on her violin, following the bow's every movement. The woman beside him, who looked to be his nanny, bent down to speak to him, her lips moving quickly, but he didn't react. He didn't nod, didn't shake his head. He just stared at Elena as though she were the only thing on that busy street worth noticing. Elena felt a flicker of curiosity. She had seen plenty of people pause to watch her, but this was different. There was something about the boy's gaze. It wasn't casual or distracted. It was focused, almost hungry, like he was trying to drink in the sound and keep it somewhere safe inside him. Without thinking too much, she changed the melody she was playing. The quick, lively tune softened into something slower, gentler, almost like a lullaby. Her fingers moved with care, pressing the strings in a way that made the notes feel round and warm. She watched the boy's eyes widen just slightly, his lips parting as if the sound had reached a place no one had touched before. The nanny tugged at his hand, murmuring something, but he shook his head, barely moving his gaze from Elena's bow. Elena kept playing, letting each note linger just a little longer in the air. The wind carried the music down the street, but in that moment, she felt as if it was meant for only one listener. The boy shifted his weight, stepping a tiny bit closer. His small hands clenched into fists at his sides, not in anger, but in some strange mix of tension and longing. Elena couldn't help but smile at him, just a small curve of her lips between notes. She had no idea who he was, no idea what his life was like, but she could sense something, a quietness about him that wasn't just shyness. The nanny looked restless. She was clearly used to keeping a strict schedule and standing in the cold. While a street musician played wasn't part of it. She bent down again, speaking firmly this time, but the boy didn't move. Elena thought she caught the faintest twitch in his expression, like he was silently begging her not to stop. She didn't. Her bow glided smoothly, each movement sending another thread of sound weaving into the air between them. For a brief, delicate moment, the noise of the city seemed to fade, as though the world had stepped back to let this strange little connection exist. Man dropped a few coins into her case without looking at her. Somewhere behind her, someone called for a taxi. But Elena stayed in that invisible line between her and the boy, the music flowing steady and true. She didn't know why she felt the need to keep playing for him, but she did. Maybe it was the way his eyes never wavered, or the way his face seemed to be holding something inside, something he didn't know how to let out. When the song ended, she let the last note hang in the air, light and trembling. The boy blinked, as if waking from a dream. His gaze finally shifted, not to the nanny, not to the crowd, but to her eyes. For the first time since she'd noticed him, Alina saw the tiniest movement of his lips. No sound came out, but it was enough to make her heart skip. She had no way of knowing it then, but this was the first thread in something much bigger. A story neither of them could have imagined that morning. The nanny finally managed to guide the boy away. But even as they walked, he kept looking back at her. Alina lowered her bow and watched until they disappeared into the crowd. The image of his steady, silent stare fixed in her mind. She didn't know who he was or why he had reacted that way, but she felt an odd certainty that this wasn't the last time she'd see him. And as she lifted her violin again and began to play for the next wave of strangers, she caught herself smiling, not for the coins, not for the passing compliments, but for a boy she didn't yet know, whose silence had somehow spoken louder than anything she'd heard in a long, long time. Daniel's world had always been quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the heavy kind that sat on his shoulders and never left. When he was a baby, his voice had been like any other child's. He laughed, cried, babbled, and sometimes even screamed when he didn't get what he wanted. But around the age of 3, something began to change. The words he once used so easily started to disappear. His parents noticed first that he was speaking less. Then the words stopped altogether. After that, silence became the only language he had. It wasn't that Daniel couldn't hear. He heard everything: the honk of cars outside, the clinking of glasses at dinner, the hum of the television in the background, but none of it called for a response from him. He lived behind invisible walls, and no matter how much people tried, no one could break them down. His father, Richard Hale, was a man who had built an empire from nothing. He was known for finding solutions to problems, for making impossible deals happen. But when it came to his son, all his money and power meant nothing. Richard had taken Daniel to the best doctors money could hire. Specialists from different countries examined him. Therapists tried countless techniques, filling rooms with flashcards, toys, and picture boards. Some believed Daniel was choosing not to speak. Others thought it was something deep in his mind that locked his voice away. Richard didn't care what the explanation was. He just wanted his son back. But months turned into years, and nothing worked. Daniel remained silent, his blue eyes always watchful, as though he understood far more than anyone gave him credit for. His mother had been the gentle balance in the family, but she passed away when Daniel was only 5. After that, the quiet in their home deepened, and Richard buried himself even more in his work. He told himself he was providing for his son, but in truth, he didn't know how to be around him. Conversations with Daniel were one-sided, filled with Richard's voice and Daniel's silence. It hurt, though Richard never admitted it. The boy's nanny, Maria, became the one constant presence in his daily life. Maria had been hired when Daniel was 4, and she had stayed because she cared. She wasn't just an employee. She understood Daniel in ways others didn't. She learned his silent signals, the way he would slightly tilt his head when he was curious, or the way his fingers tapped against his leg when he was anxious. She respected his quiet and never tried to force words out of him. She also knew Richard's rules: keep to safe places, avoid unnecessary crowds, and always keep Daniel within sight. But on that cold afternoon, everything changed. They had been walking back from the library when Daniel stopped suddenly. Maria followed his gaze and realized he was looking toward the subway entrance. She heard it too. Faint music, a violin playing somewhere below the street noise. Before she could say anything, Daniel tugged at her hand. Not hard, but with a clear insistence. He wanted to go closer. This was unusual. Daniel almost never led the way anywhere, usually followed, quiet and compliant, letting others decide where he would go. Maria hesitated, glancing at the time. Richard expected them home soon. But there was something in Daniel's eyes, a spark she hadn't seen in years. So she let him guide her. They walked toward the music, weaving through the crowd until they reached the spot where a woman stood playing her violin. She was surrounded by the usual city rush people, coming and going, some stopping for a moment, most passing without a glance. Maria saw Daniel freeze, not out of fear, but as though he had just stepped into a different world. His eyes locked. On the violin, his entire body leaning slightly forward, like he was trying to get as close as possible without moving his feet. Maria had seen him interested in things, for a picture in a book, the texture of a certain blanket. But this was different. This was deeper. His breathing slowed, his gaze sharpened, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like he was truly present. She knelt beside him, speaking softly. "Daniel, it's music. Do you like it?" Of course, she didn't expect an answer. She rarely did. But the way his fingers twitched, curling and uncurling, told her he was feeling something. The violinist noticed him too. Her melody shifted, becoming softer, warmer. Maria saw Daniel's expression change, not dramatically, but enough. His lips parted slightly. His eyes followed every movement of the bow, as if the sound was tied directly to it. Maria felt her heart ache in a way she hadn't in a long time. She wanted to believe this moment meant something, but she knew better than to hope too quickly. When the music stopped, Daniel didn't move. It was as though the end of the song had left him suspended in midair, unsure where to land. Maria gently touched his arm, telling him it was time to go, but he resisted. Not with tantrums or loud protests. Daniel never did that, but with the weight of his stillness. It was the kind of resistance that made it clear he wasn't ready to leave. Maria gave in, letting him stay for another song. She stood quietly, watching the two of them, the woman with her violin and the boy with his silence, locked in some invisible exchange that no one else on the street seemed to notice. When the second song ended, she finally coaxed him away, but his head kept turning, his eyes searching for the violinist, even as they walked back into the crowd. That night, as she tucked him into bed, Maria wondered if this would be just another passing moment in Daniel's quiet life, or if it was the beginning of something more. She didn't tell Richard about it. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because she didn't want him to dismiss it as nothing. Richard was a man who believed in results, not small signs. But Maria believed in little changes, and she had seen something in Daniel's eyes that day. A flicker of connection, as if a single note had slipped past the walls he had built. The next day, when they were out again, Daniel pulled her hand toward the same corner. Maria almost laughed at how certain he was about where he wanted to go. And when they arrived, the violinist was there, playing again, her music curling through the cold air like warm breath. Daniel stood in the same spot as before, still and focused. Maria realized this wasn't a coincidence. Whatever Daniel felt the day before, he was chasing it again. She didn't know what the music was doing to him, but she could see that it mattered. And for a boy who hadn't spoken in years, who rarely sought out anything on his own, that was reason enough for her to follow his lead. Over the next few days, it became a pattern. Whenever they were near that part of the city, Daniel would guide her to the violinist. He didn't smile, didn't clap, didn't speak, but something in the way he watched told Maria that inside his quiet world, something had begun to stir. She didn't know it yet. But these small visits were the start of a change neither she nor Richard could have predicted. She knew was that, for the first time in years, Daniel wanted to be somewhere, and that somewhere was within reach of a stranger's music. The week after their first meeting on that street corner felt different for Alina, though she couldn't have explained why. She played at her usual time every afternoon, but now, in the back of her mind, she found herself looking for a small figure in a warm coat, a boy with blue eyes, who seemed to listen with his whole being. She didn't even know his name, but the memory of the way he had stood there, rooted in place, was something she carried with her like a tune she couldn't stop humming. On the second day after their first meeting, she spotted him again. City was busy as always, taxis honking, people rushing, the smell of roasted chestnuts drifting from a street cart nearby, but she saw him through the crowd, holding the hand of the same nanny. This time he seemed almost to be pulling her toward the corner. His steps were quicker than hers, and she had to lengthen her stride to keep up. When they reached Elena's spot, he stopped, loosening his grip on the nanny's hand, and fixed his gaze right on the violin. Something inside Elena warmed. Without hesitation, she changed her song, as if she had been saving it for him. The melody was soft and playful, like sunlight flickering through leaves, gentle enough to make people slow down without realizing it. The boy didn't blink much. His eyes followed the bow's every rise and fall. He was still silent, but his face told her more than words could. There was a spark there, a kind of wonder that made him seem less like a quiet statue and more like a child caught in a secret dream. By the third visit, she knew it wasn't an accident. He was coming for the music. And each time he came, Elena tried a different kind of tune. Slower, faster, happier, sadder, watching carefully for the way his expression changed. She didn't understand why it mattered to her so much, but it did. There was something about him that made her want to find exactly the right sound, the one that might reach a part of him no one else had touched. It was on that third visit that it happened, something small, but big enough to make the nanny gasp and cover her mouth in shock. Elena had been playing a song her mother used to hum when she was a little girl, a lullaby so full of comfort that it felt like a blanket wrapped around the listener. Her fingers pressed the strings gently, her bow gliding like it was moving. Through water, the boy's shoulders relaxed, his head tilted slightly, and for a moment Elena thought she saw a shimmer in his eyes, like the music was stirring something deep inside him. Then it came so faint, she almost thought she had imagined it. His lips moved, and a soft sound slipped out. It wasn't a clear word, not something you could write down. It was more like a murmur, a tiny breath of a voice that had been locked away for far too long. Elena's own breath caught. She didn't stop playing, afraid that if she did, whatever was happening might vanish. The nanny, however, was frozen, her eyes wide and her mouth open in disbelief. She looked at the boy like she had just seen a miracle. The sound came again. Still small, still broken, but there. The boy's eyes flickered with something close to recognition, as if the music was pulling him somewhere familiar, somewhere safe. He didn't look at the nanny, didn't glance at the crowd. His attention stayed fixed on Elena, as if she were the only one who could hear the unspoken language he was trying to remember. When the song ended, the moment broke gently, like a wave rolling back into the sea. The boy blinked and stepped back, holding the nanny's hand again, but his fingers gripped hers tighter, as if asking for more without saying it. The nanny looked shaken. She leaned down, speaking softly to him, but he didn't respond in words. Instead, he just pointed a small, deliberate gesture to the violin. Elena understood. She began another piece, one just as soft, and watched as his face relaxed. Again, like the notes were a key slowly turning in a lock, they stayed longer that day. The nanny didn't try to pull him away, not after what she had seen. When they finally left, the boy kept looking back, not with desperation this time, but with a quiet sort of contentment. Elena, standing there with her violin still in hand, knew something important had just happened. She didn't know the details of his life, but she felt certain that this moment was more than a random street encounter. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. The boy returned, always with the nanny, always silent at first. But little by little, Elena noticed tiny changes, the way his lips sometimes moved in time with the music, the way his shoulders no longer stayed stiff, the way his eyes seemed brighter. And each time, Elena adjusted her songs, searching for those moments when his expression softened completely. She began to think of him as her special audience. Other people passed by, some tossing coins, some ignoring her entirely, but when the boy was there, her music was different. It wasn't about earning a few dollars anymore. It was about reaching him. She didn't know why it mattered so much to her, but the feeling was as real as the strings under her fingers. The nanny hadn't told the boy's father about these visits. Maybe she wasn't sure how to explain them. Maybe she feared he wouldn't believe her. After all, what could a street musician possibly offer that expensive specialists and therapies hadn't? But she kept bringing the boy back, drawn by the way his face changed when the violin played. One afternoon, when the crowd around Elena's corner was unusually heavy, the boy did something he hadn't done before. As she played, he took a small step forward, closer to the open violin case. Then another step. Soon, he was standing right in front of her, close enough for her to see the faint freckles on his nose. He didn't speak, but he lifted his hand slightly, almost like he wanted to touch the violin. Elena gave him the smallest nod, letting her bow glide slower, more tenderly. The boy didn't touch the instrument, but he watched it with an intensity that felt almost protective, as if it were something precious he didn't want to break. The crowd barely noticed him. To them, he was just another child watching a street performance, but to Elena, it felt like the world had narrowed down to just the two of them again. By the time the nanny gently guided him back, something had shifted. It wasn't just that the boy had made a sound that first day, it was that now, every visit seemed to carry them both further along an invisible path, step by careful step. Elena didn't know where it would lead, but she knew she wanted to keep walking it with him. What she couldn't know yet was that someone else, someone important to the boy, was about to step into this quiet little world they had built. And when he did, nothing about their lives would stay the same. Richard Hale was a man who was used to having control. His schedule was planned down to the minute. His meetings were timed with precision. And his days were built around decisions that moved millions of dollars in or out of his companies. His world time was something you managed, not wasted. That was why when he began noticing that his son's afternoons were being spent loitering near some subway entrance, he grew irritated. He couldn't understand why the nanny kept indulging whatever strange interest Daniel had there. He had never been the kind of man to believe in pointless wandering. And yet here was his son, week after week, asking to go to the same spot. One chilly afternoon, Richard decided to pick Daniel up himself. He left his office earlier than usual, a rare occurrence that made his assistant raise an eyebrow. He didn't explain why. Part of him wanted to see what exactly kept drawing Daniel to that place. And part of him, though he wouldn't admit it, was worried. He had spent so much money trying to help his son speak again. Therapists, specialists, even experimental programs abroad. None of it had worked. Daniel had stayed silent for years, communicating only through gestures or brief facial expressions. Richard told himself that if he saw nothing important happening there, he would end these visits immediately. The streets were busy as usual, but Richard spotted the subway entrance quickly. He was about to call out for Daniel when he stopped in his tracks. His son was standing still in the middle of the crowd, completely focused on something ahead. Richard followed his gaze and saw a woman, young, with a worn but graceful posture, holding a violin beneath her chin. She was playing with her eyes half closed. As though the world around her didn't exist, her bow moved with a quiet intensity, the kind that didn't try to grab attention but somehow did anyway. Richard stood there for a moment, surprised too. Find himself listening to... The sound wasn't grand or dramatic, but it was warm in a way that made him feel strangely still. He looked back at Daniel. His son's cheeks were damp, real tears were rolling down his face. And then, in the middle of all the city noise, Richard heard something that made his breath catch. More. Please. The words were soft, shaky, almost like they belonged to someone else, but they were Daniel's. His voice, unused for years, was rough and small, but it was there. Richard felt a shock run through him, so sharp it almost hurt. He had imagined this moment so many times, in therapy rooms, in doctors' offices, at night when he couldn't sleep. But it was never here, never on a street corner, never because of a stranger with a violin. He stepped forward slowly, almost afraid that if he moved too quickly, the fragile moment would shatter. Daniel didn't notice him at first. His attention was locked on the woman. Richard stopped beside him, and for a second, he didn't know what to say. Looked at the violinist. Her eyes were open now, and she was watching Daniel with a soft, knowing expression. "I'm Richard," he said. Finally, his voice sounding heavier than usual. "Daniel's father?" She gave a small nod, her bow still resting gently against the strings. "I'm Elena." There was an awkward silence, broken only by the hum of traffic nearby. Richard wanted to ask 100 questions had she met his son before. what exactly had just happened. But instead, what came out was, "Would you play again for him?" Alina gave the faintest smile and lifted her bow. This time, the melody she played was slower, with a rhythm that seemed to sway gently like the tide. Richard watched as Daniel's lips moved again, barely forming words but following the rise and fall of the music. The sound was faint, but it was there. Connection, raw and unexpected, was happening right in front of him. And Richard knew without a doubt that no therapy, no expensive program, no expert had ever reached his son like this. He glanced at Alina, wondering if she understood the enormity of what she was doing. She didn't look at him. Her focus stayed on Daniel, as if the rest of the city could disappear, and she wouldn't notice. For the first time in years, Richard felt something shift inside him, loosening. A kind of crack in the wall he had built around himself to keep out disappointment and frustration. The song ended. But Daniel didn't turn away. He took a small step toward her, his hand twitching at his side as if he wanted to reach out, but didn't know how. Alina lowered her violin slowly, giving him space. Richard swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Thank you," he said the words. Sounding too small for the weight they carried, Alina just nodded again. She didn't ask questions about money or status. She didn't seem to care who he was. All she cared about, Richard realized, was that moment between her and Daniel. On the way back to the car, Daniel surprised him again. Instead of walking silently as he usually did, he whispered a few single words here and there, violin, music. Again, each one breaking the long drought of silence Richard had grown used to. He didn't push for more. Just listened, afraid that if he tried to force it, the fragile thread would snap. When they reached the car, Rich sat behind the wheel for a long time before starting the engine. The world felt different now, like something hidden had been revealed, and he wasn't sure yet what it meant. All he knew was that he had seen something extraordinary, not just his son speaking, but his son connecting. And it had happened. Because of a woman on a street corner, a violin, a song that had somehow slipped past all the walls his son had built. That night, Richard couldn't stop thinking about it. He had built his life around results, investments that paid off, deals that closed, projects that succeeded. But here was something he couldn't measure or buy. He realized with a mix of awe and humility that this moment might be worth more than everything else he had ever achieved. The next morning, instead of heading straight to the office, he found himself driving toward the subway entrance again. Not for business, not for control, but to see if the music would still be there, waiting. From that day onward, life for Richard Hale began to look different. He had been a man whose days were built from schedules, numbers, meetings, and deadlines, where every minute had a price tag, and every decision was weighed for profit. But ever, since the moment he saw his son whisper more pleas to the street violinist, something inside him had shifted in a way he couldn't quite put into words. He still went to his meetings, still signed deals worth millions, still wore the perfectly tailored suits that made him look like a man who never slowed down, but now there was something else running through his mind. In quiet moments, he would hear the sound of Elena's violin again. Daniel had never before pulled his father anywhere. Most of their time together was planned by others, tutors, therapists, caretakers. But now, every few days, Daniel would tug at Richard's hand with surprising strength, leading him out of the polished car, through the busy streets and straight to that same subway corner. Richard followed without protest. It was almost surreal to him that his son, who once showed little interest in the world around him, now seemed to have a place that truly mattered to him. Alina would be there most days, her scarf tucked under, her chin, her fingers nimble and sure on the strings. She always noticed them the moment they appeared. She never made a big show of it, never stopped to say much, but Richard could tell when her playing changed. It became softer, richer, as though she were pouring every note directly toward Daniel. And Daniel, he would stand there still, as stone except for his eyes, which followed her every movement. Sometimes his lips would move just enough to form the shape of a word. Sometimes the faintest whisper escaped. Richard began to linger too, not just as a chaperone for his son, but as someone who found himself unexpectedly drawn to the music. He was a man who had heard orchestras play in grand halls, who had been invited to exclusive private concerts. But there was something about Elena's music on that corner that made even the sharp winter air feel warmer. She didn't play for applause, and she didn't play for prestige. She played like someone speaking a truth they didn't know how to say any other way. One afternoon, as the three of them stood together, Daniel in front, Richard slightly behind, and Elena playing, Richard realized how unusual the scene must look to passers-by. A billionaire businessman, motionless on a street corner, listening as if the fate of his world depended on each note. He didn't care. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the next meeting or the next deal. He was thinking about the fact that his son was leaning forward slightly, his lips moving in rhythm with the bow. It was after one of these visits that Richard decided to speak to Elena properly. When she had finished her song, he approached her, unsure how to begin. "You've done something for my son that no one else has managed in years," he told her, his voice lower than usual.
Oh.
Almost careful. She looked surprised, but she didn't interrupt. "You've given him something I thought he'd lost forever. I don't know what it is about your music, but it reaches him." Elena didn't claim to understand it either. She only smiled faintly and said, "Sometimes music speaks where words can't." Richard offered her a business card, the kind printed on thick, expensive stock with his name embossed in gold. "If there's anything I can do for you," he said, "anything at all, I want to help." She hesitated before taking it, her eyes flicking from the card to his face. He could tell she wasn't the type to ask for favors easily. It took a few weeks. Eventually, Elena admitted she had always dreamed of opening her own music school. Not a place for the elite, but one where anyone, regardless of their income, could learn to play. Richard listened, then quietly set the wheels in motion, made the calls, signed the papers, and within months, Elena had a small but bright space filled with instruments, students, and the sound of music spilling into the street. But one thing didn't change. She still played at the subway corner. Richard had assumed she might stop once her school opened, but she insisted on keeping those afternoons. "This is where Daniel found my music," she told him. "This is where it matters most." He didn't argue. He understood more than he could say. Daniel's voice returned slowly, like a sunrise pushing away the night. At first, it was just a few words here and there more, again, pretty. Then, short sentences. "Play the soft one. I like the happy one." The first time he said thank you to Elena, she almost stopped playing mid-song. Richard had to look away for a moment, blinking against the sudden sting in his eyes. They never treated it like a miracle cure. Daniel still had quiet days. Days when words didn't come easily. But now there was a bridge where before there had been only distance. And that bridge was made of music, of strings and bow, of the kindness of a woman who played for the joy of playing. For Richard, the change wasn't just in Daniel, it was in himself. He started noticing the small things he had once ignored, the way the light fell across the street in the late afternoon, the laughter of strangers, the smell of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor. He made time not just for his son, but for moments without agenda. The man who once measured success in profits began to measure it in something quieter, but infinitely more valuable. The sound of his boy saying, "Dad, can we go hear the violin?" Years later, when people asked Richard about the turning point in his life, he never mentioned a business deal or a windfall. He would smile a little and say, "It was a cold afternoon on a street corner when my son spoke for the first time. In years, and it started with a violin." Lena's music school thrived. Children from every corner of the city came to learn, some shy, some bold, some with voices that had been quiet for far too long. And every now and then, a man in a tailored coat would stop by sometimes with his now caught of son, sometimes alone, to listen to the music drifting into the street. He never stayed long, and he never made a show of his presence. But those who noticed him might see a small, knowing smile on his face, because Richard Hale knew that while fortunes could build towers and buy rare treasures, the most priceless gift he had ever received didn't come from a boardroom or a contract. It came from a woman on a street corner, playing a song for a boy who had forgotten how to speak and finding, in the process, the voice of a father who had forgotten how to listen.